There's a photograph. You can find it if you know where to look, buried in the National Archives, filed under a designation that doesn't match any official operation. It shows a burned forest somewhere in central Poland, dated February 1943. In the foreground, you can make out the charred remains of what appears to be a Wehrmacht encampment, but it's what's scratched on the back of the photograph that stops you cold. 3 words in German, written in what archivists confirm is human blood. Heult noch. He still howls. This is a story the German High Command tried to erase, a story that survived only because of scattered field reports, interrogation transcripts, and the nightmares of Soviet soldiers who liberated the area 18 months later. What you're about to hear isn't folklore. It's not propaganda. It's something far more disturbing. Documented evidence of an incident that left an entire Wehrmacht battalion combat ineffective, not from enemy action, but from something they found waiting for them in a forest that had already burned once before. Winter on the Eastern Front in 1943 was hell frozen over. By February, the disaster at Stalingrad had shattered German confidence, and across hundreds of miles of front line, exhausted units dug in against the Soviet counteroffensive. Among them was the 342nd Infantry Battalion, a unit composed primarily of Austrian conscripts and older German reservists, men who'd seen enough war to recognize when orders didn't make sense. And their orders made no sense at all. They were to establish a defensive position in the Chełmno Forest, a region of central Poland approximately 40 kilometers west of Łódź. The forest had no strategic value. No major roads passed through it. No rail lines. No population centers nearby. Soviet forces were pushing from the east, yes, but their advance was miles away, focused on larger objectives. Establishing a position in this isolated woodland seemed pointless, unless command knew something the men didn't. The battalion arrived on February 12, 1943. According to the war diary of Hauptmann Klaus Bergmann, the battalion's executive officer, the forest was already dead when they got there. Not winter dead. Dead in a way that immediately unsettled the men. Trees stood like black skeletons against the snow, their trunks split and weeping sap that had frozen into amber tears. The undergrowth had been consumed entirely, leaving nothing but ash-dusted snow between the dead trees. Bergmann noted in his diary that the men asked what had burned the forest. The answer they received from their commanding officer, Oberstleutnant Heinrich Graf, was curt and strange. It burned a long time ago. We're not here because of the fire. We're here because of what survived it. No further explanation was offered. The men were ordered to dig in. Have you ever felt watched by a landscape? Not by people, by the land itself? Multiple soldiers would later describe that sensation. The burned forest wasn't just dead. It was attentive, waiting. The first night passed without incident, though few men slept well. Temperatures had dropped to -20 degrees Celsius, and the wind moving through the charred trees created sounds that the veterans in the unit, men who'd survived Russia's winters, said they'd never heard before. Not the typical groan of wood or whistle of air through branches, something more deliberate, almost interrogative, like the forest was testing sounds, trying to find the right pitch. On the second day, they discovered the trench. A reconnaissance patrol pushing deeper into the forest stumbled across it around midday. It was a Soviet trench system. That much was clear from the design, but old, very old. The wood reinforcements had rotted away almost completely. The earthworks had partially collapsed. And here's what disturbed the patrol leader, Feldwebel Otto Dietrich. There were no spent cartridges, no discarded equipment, no debris of warfare. Just the trench itself, empty and immaculate under a thin layer of snow, as if it had been deliberately cleaned before being abandoned. Dietrich ordered his men to search the trench line. What they found in the command bunker would be documented in 3 separate after-action reports, each one reading nearly identical, as if the men needed to corroborate what they'd witnessed to believe it themselves. The bunker was intact. The entrance hadn't collapsed, and inside, arranged in a perfect circle on the frozen earth floor, were 12 Soviet helmets. Not scattered, not fallen from pegs on the wall. Arranged, each one facing inward toward the center of the circle, where someone had carved words into the dirt floor in Cyrillic letters. One of the German soldiers, an Austrian conscript named Joseph Kahl, who'd grown up near the Russian border and spoke some Russian, translated the words. "We heard the forest howl, we answered. Now we are the howl." Dietrich ordered the bunker sealed. When he reported his findings to Hauptmann Bergmann, the response was immediate and, in retrospect, terrifying. The battalion was to withdraw from that sector of the forest immediately. No further patrols were to approach the Soviet trench line. And under no circumstances were the men to discuss what had been found in the bunker. But soldiers talk. By nightfall, the entire battalion knew about the helmets and the message carved in the dirt. And now they understood something their officers hadn't told them. They weren't the first unit sent to this forest. The Soviets had been here before, and whatever they'd encountered had made them leave behind a warning. That night, the howling began. Multiple witnesses, dozens of them, all describing the same phenomenon with the same disturbing details. It started around 2300 hours during the darkest part of the night when the moon had set and the only light came from the stars reflecting off the snow. The sentries heard it first, a sound rising from somewhere deep in the burned forest in the direction of the sealed Soviet bunker. It began as a low moan, barely distinguishable from the wind, but within minutes it escalated into what every single soldier would later describe as a human scream, prolonged impossibly long, warbling between notes like someone trying to find the right frequency of agony. It wasn't the scream of someone in sudden pain. It was the scream of someone who'd been screaming so long they'd forgotten how to stop. And then it multiplied. The single voice became two, then four, then a chorus of howling that seemed to come from every direction simultaneously, echoing off the charred trees until the entire forest reverberated with the sound. Men who'd survived artillery barrages, who'd listened to wounded comrades die slowly in no man's land, would later say they'd never heard anything that frightened them like that howling, because it wasn't random. It had rhythm. It had pattern. It was communicating. Hauptmann Bergmann's war diary entry from that night is difficult to read, not because of the handwriting, which remains precise despite the circumstances, but because of what it reveals about the psychological state of the men. "The howling continued for approximately 40 minutes, he wrote. Attempts to locate the source proved impossible. The sound appeared to emanate from the trees themselves. Several men discharged their weapons into the forest. The howling paused for perhaps 30 seconds, then resumed at greater volume and closer proximity. I ordered all firing to cease. At 00:15 hours, the howling stopped abruptly, mid-scream, as if someone had severed it with a knife. The silence afterward was worse than the sound. Sentries reported seeing movement in the forest during the howling. Not human movement. Something that traveled between the burned trees without disturbing the snow. Dark shapes that seemed to drift rather than walk. One sentry, a man named Rudolf Stein, filed a report claiming he'd seen one of the shapes approach within 50 meters of his position. He described it as man-shaped but wrong in its proportions, too tall and too thin, with arms that hung past where its knees should be. When he challenged it, calling out the standard halt command, the shape stopped. And then it tilted its head at an angle Stein said no human neck could achieve, studying him for perhaps 10 seconds before drifting backward into the trees, moving away without turning around. Stein was found unconscious at his post 2 hours later. He'd urinated himself, something that would normally be a source of mockery among the men, but no one said a word. They'd all heard the howling. They'd all seen the shapes. If you've ever served in a military unit, you know there's a point where group cohesion either strengthens or shatters under pressure. The 342nd was approaching that point rapidly. By the morning of February 15th, 3 days into their deployment, the men were fracturing along a fault line of belief. Some were convinced they were being harassed by Soviet partisans using psychological warfare tactics. Others, particularly the older soldiers and the few Catholics among them, had begun making the sign of the cross when they looked toward the burned forest, and a few, the ones who'd stopped sleeping entirely, had started asking why command had sent them here at all. Oberstleutnant Graf called an officers' meeting that afternoon. What was discussed remains partially classified, but fragments have emerged from post-war interrogations. Graf revealed that the 342nd wasn't on a defensive mission. They were bait. German intelligence had received reports of Soviet units experiencing mass psychological breakdown in this region dating back to 1941, shortly after the German invasion. Multiple Red Army companies had simply stopped advancing, stopped retreating, stopped responding to orders. When recovery teams went looking for them, they found empty positions and, in 3 separate instances, arrangements of equipment and personal effects that suggested ritual behavior. The German High Command wanted to understand what was causing these breakdowns, not out of humanitarian concern. They wanted to weaponize it. Graf told his officers they were to observe and document any unusual phenomena. They were to maintain position regardless of what they experienced. And they were not, under any circumstances, to enter the burned forest beyond their established perimeter. By that night, it was already too late. The forest had come to them. The second howling began at exactly 2300 hours, as if something was keeping time. But this time it was different. This time the voices were forming words, not German words, not Russian, something older. Several soldiers would later claim the language sounded like Old Church Slavonic, a liturgical language that hadn't been commonly spoken for centuries. One Austrian soldier, a former seminary student named Franz Müller, said he recognized fragments of Orthodox funeral rites mixed with something else, something that made his teeth ache when he tried to listen too closely. And then the burned trees began to move, not swaying in wind, moving. Witnesses described the charred trunks bending at angles that defied the structural integrity of wood, leaning inward toward the German positions as if trying to see better. The sound of wood creaking under stress filled the night, competing with the howling until the forest became a symphony of wrongness. At 23:47 hours, Feldwebel Otto Dietrich, the same man who'd discovered the Soviet bunker, walked out of the German perimeter toward the burned forest. He did this in full view of a dozen soldiers. He did this while holding his rifle at port arms, as if marching to receive orders. When sentries called out to him, he didn't respond. When Hauptmann Bergmann personally ordered him to halt, Dietrich kept walking. He walked into the burned forest and disappeared between the twisted black trees. 3 soldiers disobeyed orders and went after him. Only 2 came back. The 2 who returned did so within 15 minutes, running, weapons abandoned, screaming for the medics. Both men were bleeding from their ears. Both men were trying to claw at their own faces. By the time medical personnel reached them, one had torn out his left eye. The other had bitten through his own tongue. Neither man could speak coherently, but they could point. They pointed toward the forest. And then, in a moment of terrible lucidity, one of them grabbed Bergmann's coat and pulled him close enough to whisper 4 words that appear in Bergmann's diary, exactly as the soldier said them. He joined the Howling. The battalion evacuated before dawn on February 16th. Oberstleutnant Graf filed a report claiming enemy partisan activity had made the position untenable. The official record lists 3 men as missing in action: Feldwebel Dietrich and the 3rd soldier who'd gone after him, a man named Paul Richter. The 2 who returned were transferred to a military hospital and subsequently disappeared from all records. But here's what the official record doesn't mention. Here's what only emerged decades later from Soviet archives and the testimony of Red Army soldiers who entered the Chełmno Forest in August 1944 during the liberation of Poland. The burned forest had grown. Soviet reconnaissance units reported that the area of burned trees had expanded by approximately 2 square kilometers since German military cartographers had last mapped the region. The pattern of burning was consistent. Trees stripped of all vegetation, bark split and weeping frozen sap, wood charred black but not consumed. And throughout the newly burned area, the Red Army found German equipment, not scattered in retreat, arranged. Helmets in circles, rifles stacked in geometric patterns, personal effects laid out in lines pointing deeper into the forest. They found Feldwebel Dietrich 300 meters past the original German perimeter. Or rather, they found his uniform and his identification tags. The uniform was empty but still held the shape of a man, posed in a walking position, arms at his sides, head tilted back as if looking up at the sky through the burned canopy. When Soviet soldiers approached to investigate, the uniform collapsed into ash that the wind scattered immediately. The tags remained where they fell. One soldier pocketed them, thinking he'd return them through proper channels. By that evening, he'd hanged himself from a tree in the Red Army encampment. The tags were found still clutched in his hand. His comrades burned them rather than touch them again. The Soviet unit was withdrawn within 24 hours. Their commander, a Captain Mikhail Sokolov, filed a report that was immediately classified. In 1989, during the Glasnost period, that report was briefly available to researchers before being reclassified. In it, Sokolov stated that his men had heard howling coming from the burned forest throughout their brief deployment. He described the sound as human voices attempting to remember how to be human and failing. He noted that the howling seemed to intensify whenever his men looked directly at the burned trees for too long, and he recorded one final disturbing detail. On their last night in the area, his sentries reported seeing shapes moving between the charred trunks, shapes that stood upright like men but moved wrong, and among them, one that wore the silhouette of a German Wehrmacht uniform. The Chełmno Forest still exists. The burned section remains, though it's significantly larger now than it was in 1943. Polish forestry services have attempted reforestation efforts 3 times. Each time, the planted trees died within weeks, turning black and weeping sap as if they'd burned from the inside out. The area is officially closed to public access, officially because of unexploded ordnance from the war. But local foresters tell a different story. They say the howling never stopped. It's just learned to be quieter, rising only on certain nights when the moon is dark and the wind moves through the trees in the wrong direction. They say hunters who enter the burned forest sometimes come back changed, speaking in voices that don't quite match their faces, tilting their heads at angles that make your spine crawl when you notice it. And they say that if you're foolish enough to enter the burned forest at night, and if you listen very carefully past the wind and the settling of dead wood, you can still hear them. Feldwebel Dietrich and the men who went after him, and the 12 Soviet soldiers whose helmets were arranged in a circle, and all the others who came before and after, all of them howling together in the darkness, trying to remember the words that will let them stop. The photograph I mentioned at the beginning, the one with the blood-written message on the back, it's been analyzed by multiple forensic experts. The blood is human, type O positive, consistent with German military medical records from the period. But here's what makes experts uncomfortable. The photograph shows the burned forest in winter, February 1943. But chemical analysis of the blood indicates it was fresh when applied to the photograph. Sometime in late 1944 or early 1945, nearly 2 years after the 342nd Battalion's evacuation, someone wrote that message long after the unit had left. Someone who was still there. Someone who wanted us to know. Halt noch. He still howls. I've spent years researching incidents like this one, stories that exist in the margins of military history where the official record goes silent and the whispered accounts begin. What happened in the Chełmno Forest isn't an isolated incident. There are burned forests in Russia where Red Army units vanished completely. There are sections of the Western Front where soldiers on both sides refused to patrol after dark, not because of the enemy, but because of what the trenches had become. There are places where war opened doors that should never have been opened, where violence and terror and mass death created conditions for something to emerge or to be invited in. The rational mind wants explanations. Gas attacks causing hallucinations, mass hysteria triggered by the stress of combat, propaganda stories weaponized by intelligence services, and maybe that's all it is. Maybe every single soldier who heard the howling, who saw the shapes moving between the burned trees, who watched their comrades walk voluntarily into the darkness, maybe all of them were mistaken. Maybe the forest was just a forest, and the burned trees were just trees. But then I remember Hauptmann Bergmann's final diary entry, dated February 16, 1943, written during the evacuation. He wrote, "I do not know what we encountered in that forest. I do not know if it was there before the war or if we brought it with us. I do not know if it was Soviet or German or something that predates both. I know only that it is still there, and it is waiting for the next men who are sent to that place. And when they arrive, it will test them as it tested us. It will howl, and some of them will answer. If you've heard similar stories from soldiers who served in Poland during the war, or if you know of other locations where units reported phenomena they couldn't explain, leave a comment. These stories exist because men like Bergman documented them, because they believed someone needed to know. Make sure you're subscribed, because there are more stories like this one that deserve to be told. Warnings from men who encountered something in the darkness of war and tried to leave us a record of what they'd seen. The howling soldier in the Chełmno Forest is still howling. The burned trees are still standing, still waiting. And somewhere in the archives, in files marked with classifications that ensure only a few people will ever read them, there are photographs and reports and blood-written warnings from men who learned too late that some forests aren't burned by fire. They're burned by what lives in them. If this story disturbed you, if it made you think about the things we don't talk about from war, if it reminded you that there are places in this world where the map ends and the true darkness begins, leave a like. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. These stories matter because they're real, because men lived them and died trying to tell them. The howling continues, and somewhere, in a forest that's still burning from the inside out, something is listening for the next soldier who'll answer it.